She entered Hollywood like an omen of Cupid's ill will. Her eyes, a shade of violet not from makeup, but as if an electromagnetic storm raged within. Her skin, stark white, seemed born to reflect the camera's flash. Every turn of her head slowed time for men, while women watched with caution. Not because she outshone them, but because she wielded beauty like a dagger, gleaming and unblinking as it cut deep. Elizabeth Taylor didn't seek love, she drew it in, a siren's call to a Dix, then scorched every heart that crossed her path. Wedding rings, lined up in a drawer, stood as evidence of romantic crimes never brought to justice. She held no secrets, yet she never told the full truth either. She once loved a man born into a hotel empire. Young, powerful, yet a murky stain always clouded his eyes. On their honeymoon, he shattered a mirror with his fist in a fit of baseless jealousy, his blood stained her hair, and she didn't leave. Not from weakness, but because she believed she could tame violence with sex and tears. Her first mistake wasn't marrying him, but thinking love could cure the one who needed healing. Then she fell into the arms of an English gentleman, composed, 20 years her senior, silent as a muted radio. At first, there was safety. Then came blandness. Then, despair. She sat in her Beverly Hills mansion, listening to the clinking of wine glasses, feeling herself transform into a voiceless, luxurious shadow. People said she thrived on drama. No. She simply couldn't bear the silence of a life without vibration. Her next love was like a gas explosion in a theater, brilliant, unexpected, leaving only ashes. He was a man of many talents, one who always appeared as if the world were a stage reserved solely for him. He loved her with the fervor of a blockbuster production, loud, with helicopter shots. The press branded her a husband stealer, a purple gown phantom, a man-eating widow. Her friends called, not to talk, but to curse. Some claimed they fought backstage at an awards ceremony. One of them had a bleeding lip. Then came him. The only man who could make her cry with just a look. They met in Rome. A sprawling film set. The director lost control as the two leads blurred the lines between script and reality. She and he collided like fire and gasoline, wild, brutal, addicted. The world tried to tear them apart. The church condemned them. The studio threatened lawsuits. Their legal spouses sent letters demanding compensation for defamation. They laughed, spat red wine on the papers, and decided to move in together. They married. Then divorced. Then remarried. Then divorced again. A friend once remarked, they weren't addicted to alcohol, not to drugs. In a fit of rage, she threw her 69-carat diamond into the toilet, then made him retrieve it. And he did. After that, she attempted what countless women do after heartbreak. She married an ordinary man. A polite man. A man with a clean political record and resume. But how could a whirlwind survive in a windless desert? She began drinking at 4 p.m. Then 2 p.m. Then 11 a.m. Then she stopped looking at the clock altogether. The last man in her life, the one the press called the construction worker, entered her life not because of her glamour, but because they found themselves in the same place, rehab. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth Taylor was called by her real name without any title. She thought this was redemption. But the weight of their age difference, class, language, and shared histories proved too heavy, and everything fell apart. When they parted, she didn't cry. But 3 nights later, the men who passed through her life weren't casual visitors, they were soldiers going to war. Some survived. Others were never the same again. She didn't love for happiness. She loved because to not love was to die. And in the end, when the stage lights dimmed, only a woman remained, draped in purple velvet, hair curled, wearing an enormous diamond, sitting by a window, writing something in a black leather journal. Her maid said it was a diary, but no one was ever allowed to read it. The First Prince, the case of Conrad Hilton Jr. At the tender age of 18, Elizabeth Taylor lost her freedom, and perhaps, a piece of her very soul. It wasn't through shackles or overt coercion, but by the shimmering mirage of a love she mistakenly believed was her destiny. At the zenith of her blossoming youth, she unwittingly tumbled into the embrace of a name perched precariously atop the world, a man whose veins pulsed with the very blood of empire builders, of undeniable power and absolute dominion. This was Conrad Hilton Jr., known more intimately as Nicky, the illustrious heir to the renowned Hilton Hotel empire. To Taylor, at that innocent juncture of her life, he was more than just a man. He was the vibrant embodiment of the American dream, young, fabulously wealthy, wielding immense influence, and hailing from a lineage that sparkled like a perfectly cut diamond, promising a future paved with silk and limitless privilege. It was a sweet, intoxicating illusion, a fatal lure, cloaked in dazzling glamour and the fervent admiration of a captivated public. Their wedding, held on May 6, 1950, wasn't merely an event, it was a phenomenon, a legend whispered through the hallowed halls of Hollywood and far beyond. It transcended the concept of a simple marriage, morphing into a meticulously staged spectacle of unparalleled opulence and raw power, orchestrated by the formidable MGM studios themselves. At an astonishing cost of $25,000, an astronomical sum for the era. The pristine white gown, a masterpiece crafted by Helen Rose, MGM's celebrated costume designer, was exquisitely adorned with thousands of shimmering pearls, embracing the delicate contours of the bride, making her appear no less than a fairy tale princess stepping from a storybook. All 3 grand floors of the Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills were utterly smothered in a fragrant deluge of fresh orchids and roses, imported from every corner of the globe. The most powerful and feared in the realms of cinema, finance, and even politics, jostled for position, desperate to witness that historic moment, the first public kiss shared by the young couple. Heralded by every newspaper as the golden pair, the wedding of the century. Film cameras whirred, flashbulbs erupted in a relentless, blinding storm, capturing every fleeting moment. Everyone clamored for an exclusive image, a scandalous scoop, a piece of the gilded narrative. Amidst the roaring crowds and the saccharine chorus of congratulations, Taylor smiled. It was the triumphant, slightly naive smile of someone who had just won the first major gamble of her life, a dazzling grin that hinted at victory and youthful pride. Yet, hidden deep beneath that luminous facade, she remained blissfully unaware that the deck had been stacked long before the cards were dealt. That glittering triumph was nothing more than a prearranged charade, meticulously choreographed by unseen forces, and she, the unwitting quarry. And the stuff of timeless fairy tales. But from the very first night within their ultra-luxurious hotel suite, the velvet curtain of illusion was brutally, irrevocably torn away, and the prince, Conrad Hilton Jr., revealed his true, twisted, dark nature. He was not the polished, immaculate figure so often seen in glossy magazine spreads or celebrated in fawning newspaper articles. He was an addict, a heavy drunkard, constantly seeking the fiery liquid that blurred his reason and unleashed his primal, base instincts. He was addicted to power. A venomous conviction that allowed him to manipulate everything, every person around him, like marionettes on a string. And above all, he was addicted to the destructive thrill of smashing everything to assert his control, to confirm his dominance, to satiate his sick, possessive craving for absolute rule. In that lavish hotel room, a sanctuary that should have been steeped in the gentle warmth of burgeoning love and passionate romance, he dragged her into an endless, drunken debauchery. A relentless cascade of days and nights consumed by alcohol and escalating mania. The clinking of bottles against glass grew sharp and discordant, his booming, hollow laughter echoed. Savage and empty, and his whispered demands gradually escalated into guttural roars, punctuated by vile, vulgar insults. In that gilded cage, sex and stark terror commingled in a sickening, perverse dance, a horrifying fusion that slowly, agonizingly strangled every last vestige of Taylor's innocent, romantic girlish dreams. There were no tender kisses, no whispered endearments. Only a brutal, possessive act, a battle waged upon her very flesh and spirit, or she was merely a plaything in the hands of a drunken tyrant. When those horrific memories rushed back unbidden, that on that very night, he had hurled an expensive crystal perfume bottle with savage force against the wall simply because she dared to refuse to perform her marital duties as he so crudely defined them. The shattering glass splintered with a deafening, cold shriek, like the very fragments of her soul. A sharp shard embedded itself chillingly close to her head in the pristine white satin pillow, mere inches from causing a grave injury. Blood from his forehead trickled down, dark and viscous, staining his pale skin, creating a macabre tableau. But instead of registering pain or remorse, he erupted into a grotesque, cackling laugh, a truly savage sound that reverberated through the empty room. It was the laugh of a deeply disturbed mind. A man who knew with chilling certainty that he had successfully planted the first seed of fear into the tender heart of another, a fear that would shadow her for the rest of her life. So familiar from film posters, had utterly vanished, as if erased by an invisible hand. She appeared pale, visibly emaciated. But the grim truth was far more brutal, more agonizing than any rumor. She was constantly vomiting due to the alcohol, the acrid liquid that Conrad Hilton Jr. forced her to consume each night. As part of his depraved game of control, designed to render her weak and compliant, the Hilton prince had systematically transformed her from a vibrant, energetic screen goddess into a lifeless doll. Emotionless smile when the camera lenses were aimed at her, and to remain utterly silent, passively submitting his physical and emotional agony tormented her from within. Many nights, unable to find an exit. The household staff, witnessing these unsettling nocturnal perambulations, grew fearful, believing she was sleepwalking, caught in a waking nightmare. But she was more awake than ever, hauntingly lucid, yet tragically uncertain of what to do with such terrifying clarity. Her mind was a chaotic battlefield, where fragments of horrifying memories endlessly swirled, ceaselessly haunting her. On one occasion, she ventured into Conrad's medicine cabinet, gazing at the long rows of prescription bottles. Pills of every color and shape, from sedatives to sleeping pills. She wondered if she were to mix them all into the glass of wine he habitually forced upon her, would it be enough to make her heart stop beating permanently, to end it all without enduring any more pain? The thought flickered through her mind, cold and tempting. That prevented her from succumbing to utter despair or embracing that final, tempting escape, was not a fragile thread of hope for a brighter future, but a scorching ember of fury slowly igniting deep within her soul. That rage, initially a mere spark, gradually swelled, transforming into a formidable latent power, an intense will to survive. One day, after he had violently shoved her against the bathroom doorframe, she slowly picked herself up. Blood trickled from her swollen cheekbone, a stark red against her pale skin. She didn't cry. Her gaze met her own reflection in the mirror, and in that moment, it was no longer the fearful, naive stare of a frightened girl or the resigned gaze of a passive victim, but the hardened gaze of a warrior pushed to the absolute brink, of someone who had resolved to fight back. She turned to him, her voice weak but imbued with an unwavering resolve. A declaration that felt like a destined vow, resonating in the silent tension of the room. If I don't leave this place, he will kill me. Not with a knife, but by inches, day by agonizing day. He will consume my soul. Those words were not merely a warning, they were a declaration of war. The divorce proceedings unfolded with astonishing swiftness. Barely a year after their much-touted wedding, yet they erupted into a scandal that dwarfed any previous public uproar. Conrad Hilton Jr. Utterly determined to protect his gilded reputation and vast assets, to stifle every dissenting voice. He sought to crush her, to brand her as the pathetic, errant party, the one solely responsible for the marriage's demise. But she, with the subtle yet potent backing of MGM Studios, the very studio that had invested in her as a priceless asset, presented cold, irrefutable evidence, meticulously and discreetly gathered. There were photographs documenting the brutal bruises on her body, handwritten letters from him, sometimes deceptively sweet and enchanting. Those silent witnesses whose eyes had observed every horror unfolding behind the closed doors of that luxurious villa, where a promised paradise had mutated into a living hell. She was no longer the dreamy, innocent, fragile ingenue of yesteryear, but a deeply wounded queen, a monarch who had understood that to survive in this relentlessly harsh world. Elizabeth Taylor vanished from public sight for a period. She retreated to a secluded private hospital in England, cloistering herself there for nearly 3 weeks for rest and recuperation, a veiled term for healing the physical and psychological wounds inflicted upon her. The press, with its frenzied curiosity and predatory instincts, relentlessly attempted to breach her privacy but were thwarted by the impenetrable defenses erected by MGM's management and her legal team. Rumors circulated wildly: she had undergone an abortion. She was receiving intensive psychological therapy after the emotional trauma. But later, a close, trusted friend of Taylor's, to transform her brokenness into strength. It wasn't merely a process of recovery, but a profound metamorphosis, a self-tempering of the spirit. And so it was, when she reappeared before the public. It was not merely a mundane, subdued return. It was a spectacular, utterly dramatic resurrection, like a vibrant phoenix rising majestically from the ashes of its own immolation. She strode onto the red carpet in sharp, spiked stiletto heels, a defiant symbol of her newfound edge, her untamed spirit, and formidable strength. Her lips, painted a vivid, challenging crimson, they spoke of fiery audacity, like a burning brand, and her eyes, no longer shadowed by fear or naive innocence, now held a steely, unwavering gaze, honed like tempered steel. Faded detail in her yet unpublished memoir. One brutal chapter had closed, a case had been resolved by the unwavering resilience of the victim, and a new, more powerful. When a hesitant reporter timidly inquired about Conrad Hilton Jr., her first husband, Elizabeth Taylor merely offered a gentle shrug, a gesture steeped in disdain and nonchalance. That was the first time I mistook passion for prison. Then she smiled, a smile whose true meaning the world now understood implicitly, a smile crafted to conceal the deep. Instinctively, that it was the only way to continue the fight, to avoid succumbing under the weight of curious and judgmental eyes. Her gaze swept past, as if piercing through the very fabric of time. No visible casualties, yet one that left an invisible, profound scar upon her soul, a perpetual reminder of the first bitter lesson in betrayal and the indomitable strength found within. Michael Wilding, The Case of the Silent Man and the Illusion of Peace. When Elizabeth Taylor emerged from her first marriage to Conrad Hilton Jr., the wounds were still festering. Like a deep burn that seemed healed on the surface but throbbed with persistent agony beneath the skin. This wasn't merely the sting of a failed union, it was the raw, open wound of a young woman's shattered idealism, a brutal awakening to the dark undercurrents of volatile passion and destructive control. The glamorous facade of Hollywood had crumbled, revealing the ugly truth of a marriage marred by alcohol-fueled rages, verbal abuse, and physical intimidation. She no longer sought the fervent, destructive passions that had nearly consumed her. Those intense flames had scorched her spirit, leaving her yearning for an antidote, a powerful counter-narrative to the chaos. She craved instead something akin to absolute security. Like a potent sedative to dull the incessant pain, a balm for her bruised psyche. What she truly desired was a sanctuary, a haven as solid and impenetrable as a room with a sturdy, bolted door. But utterly devoid of screams or shattering glass, a place where the air was thick with tranquility rather than tension. This profound longing for peace, for an end to the ceaseless drama that had characterized her early public life, became the guiding force in her next significant relationship. And into her life stepped Michael Wilding, a quiet, impeccably polite man, 2 decades her senior, an English actor with classic features and a measured, understated demeanor. He drifted into her existence not with a dramatic flourish or a passionate declaration, but like a melancholic lullaby, gentle and soothing, yet subtly imbued with a chilling, bone-deep loneliness that Elizabeth, perhaps subconsciously, recognized in herself. His very presence was a stark contrast to the explosive energy of Hilton. Where Hilton had been a whirlwind of unpredictable emotion, Wilding was a steady, almost inert, presence. This stillness was precisely what drew Taylor in. A desperate moth to a seemingly serene flame. She was exhausted, emotionally depleted, and Wilding offered the promise of rest. Wilding was the quintessential English gentleman, possessing a refined face, deep-set eyes that hinted at countless unspoken thoughts, and a voice as soft and smooth as London silk. He was no drunkard. The very idea seemed an affront to his composed nature. He never bellowed in fits of rage, his voice rarely rising above a conversational murmur. He never smashed furniture, unlike Conrad Hilton, who used destruction to assert his volatile power and instill fear. He simply existed like an old, leather-bound armchair in the corner of a grand drawing room, never moving from its appointed place, never bothering anyone with demanding outbursts or volatile emotions, and, critically, never truly embracing anyone completely. His presence was one of passive acceptance rather than active engagement. He was a witness to life, rather than a participant in it. She encountered him on a film set, ironically. A sanctuary where she was desperately trying to rediscover her rhythm, to piece herself back together after the brutal, violent fall from grace that had marked her first foray into matrimony. The film set, often a place of manufactured emotion and heightened drama, became, for her, a temporary refuge from her real-life turmoil. And he, strangely gentle, inexplicably patient, simply sat beside her as if desiring nothing from her, only willing to listen to the fractured pieces of her soul, to the unspoken sighs of her anguish. His quiet presence, like a harbor without a single ripple, offered a weary balm to her battered heart. She believed, in that fragile moment, that this was it, this was where she could finally lower her sails, where she could cease fighting. The absence of conflict was mistaken for the presence of peace, and the lack of pain was conflated with love. The Symphony of Silence. They married in February 1952 in London, a ceremony devoid of fanfare, a deliberate departure from the glittering spectacle of her previous wedding. There were no lurking shadows of paparazzi, no frenzied media circus, without a glittering, pearl-encrusted gown like her previous spectacle, and causing barely a ripple in the relentless tides of media frenzy. It was merely a whispered promise, soft yet profoundly weighty for Taylor, "I won't hurt you." For Elizabeth, who had endured far too much pain and outright brutality, that single vow was enough to label it love, enough to believe she had finally found a safe haven, a gilded cage perhaps, but one free from the invisible chains that had choked her spirit. The absence of the negative, for a time, felt like the ultimate positive. She was so desperate to escape the storms that even a becalmed sea, however stagnant, felt like salvation. In the initial months of their marriage, she felt an ethereal lightness, as if she were living inside a wordless jazz composition, melodic, serene, devoid of drama, without a single crescendo, only gentle, flowing notes. The domestic routine was a comforting novelty. Each morning, she would brew her own steaming coffee, inhaling its familiar, comforting aroma, a simple act of self-sufficiency she had not truly experienced before. Each evening, she would sit by the warm fireplace, immersed in a book, the gentle crackle of the flames the only sound to break the pervasive stillness. Elizabeth Taylor, the shimmering icon of American cinema. Hollywood's most coveted woman, lived then like an ordinary housewife in a quiet London suburban home, far removed from the dazzling spotlights. Far from the ceaseless turmoil and scandalous whispers of Hollywood. This period was a deliberate retreat, an attempt to shed the persona and find the woman underneath. The American and British press, with palpable relief, declared she had matured, that she had found peace at last. They interpreted her withdrawal as a sign of growth, a taming of the wild spirit that had captivated and sometimes scandalized the public. But she dared not utter the stark truth, even to herself for a time. She was hiding. She wasn't finding peace. She was seeking refuge from herself, from the pain, from the very fiery passion that had once consumed her. She embraced Wilding's silence like a thick blanket, covering her festering wounds. A shield against the cacophony of the world, both internal and external. His quietude offered a temporary reprieve, a much-needed respite from the relentless demands of her public and private life. 3 months passed. Then 6. A year. This peace, initially a miraculous balm, gradually transmuted into a gnawing, unbearable emptiness. The absence of pain began to feel like the absence of everything. Wilding exerted no control over her life, a blessing initially, but he also made no profound connection with her soul. There was no physical violence, but neither was there any palpable desire, no ember of love or shared passion. Everything simply drifted along, steady, slow, utterly devoid of resonance. Like a boat becalmed in a vast, featureless ocean. The quietude that had once been soothing now felt suffocating, a vacuum where vibrant emotions should have been. The silence, initially a shield, became a mirror reflecting her own profound loneliness. One day, she walked into the study and found him seated in his worn leather armchair, utterly motionless. This image, almost sculptural in its stillness, struck her with an unexpected chill. He read his newspaper for 3 consecutive hours without once raising his head to glance at her, without a single question. Without a solitary gesture of affection, even though she stood there, silently observing him, yearning for some acknowledgement. And in that precise moment, a chilling truth sliced through her like a razor blade. She knew she wasn't loved, she was merely tolerated, indulged, her presence accepted as an inseparable, yet inert part of an emotionally barren tableau. She wasn't the center of his universe, she was simply an object within his carefully curated living space, another piece of furniture in his quiet, unchanging world. The realization was devastating in its quiet finality, far more insidious than an angry outburst. It was the slow, methodical erosion of her sense of self-worth. The fracture of apathy and the uprising of emotion. As time inexorably wore on, the invisible chasm between them widened like a hairline crack in a wall, initially a subtle filament, then gradually lengthening, deepening, until it ultimately threatened to consume the entire ceiling, imperiling the very structure of their shared existence. The lack of active engagement, the absence of shared joy or sorrow, created an emotional void that Elizabeth, by her very nature, could not tolerate indefinitely. Taylor began to feel suffocated within the very peace she had so desperately craved. The silence, once a comfort, now felt like a shroud, stifling her vibrant spirit. She realized that this quietude, far from being peaceful, was slowly extinguishing her. Driven by an innate need for emotional expression and connection, she returned to the film set, citing the need to reawaken through her roles, to rekindle the intense emotions her marital life simply could not provide. The artificial world of filmmaking became her true escape. A place where she could experience passion, conflict, and connection, even if it was scripted. She yearned for the dazzling stage lights, for for the visceral experience of embodying complex characters, of truly loving and truly being hated, rather than this numbing indifference. The theatricality of film was a welcome antidote to the oppressive banality of her domestic life. Meanwhile, Wilding, long accustomed to the quietude, to his monotonous and colorless existence, began to frequent discreet, exclusive parties of the elite, where young, beautiful women smiled at him, not necessarily because of his famous wife, but perhaps for his quiet generosity or his cultivated, sophisticated demeanor. He found his own form of quiet amusement, a polite detachment that shielded him from any deep emotional demands. This chilling indifference wasn't a case of violent assault, it was a case of utter neglect, of emotions starved to death. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation of the heart. One evening, at a glittering Beverly Hills gala, a stark contrast to their quiet London home, Taylor spotted Wilding deep in conversation with a young ballerina, a vibrant flower at least a decade her junior. His hand rested lightly on the small of the dancer's back, a gesture that, at first glance, seemed innocuous, a polite social touch. But to Taylor, it was anything but. It was a physical manifestation of a connection she desperately lacked. His eyes held a flicker of amusement and a certain fascination she had never seen him direct at her, a spark he had never offered her. This fleeting glimpse of an emotional engagement he denied her was more painful than any open infidelity could have been. She approached, maintaining an almost unervingly composed demeanor. The years of public scrutiny having taught her how to mask her turmoil, but her heart had already registered the irreparable fracture. The illusion of peace shattered. Upon their silent return home, amidst the chilling stillness of the grand villa, a stillness that now felt menacing rather than comforting, she questioned him, her voice firm yet devoid of anger, like a cold, precise interrogation. She wasn't seeking a fight, she was seeking clarity, an answer to the gnawing emptiness. "What do you need from me, Michael?" Her question was a desperate plea for understanding, an attempt to bridge the vast chasm that had opened between them. He merely replied, his voice calm to the point of being unsettling, as if she were a burdensome weight he needed to shed. A disturbance to his preferred tranquility. Tranquility. "You always bring storms." She laughed. A bitter, hollow sound, like someone who had just discovered her umbrella was utterly shredded in the middle of a torrential downpour. Realizing that the very thing she believed offered shelter had offered no protection at all, the word tranquility echoed mockingly in her ears. And she understood Michael had not betrayed her with another woman in the conventional sense. His betrayal was far more profound and insidious. He had betrayed her with a prolonged, soul-crushing apathy, a disinterest so pervasive it made one feel like a mere shadow, a non-entity, an invisible pain no one could touch. His betrayal wasn't an explosive act, it was a slow, cruel erosion, a gradual diminishment of her spirit. She recognized that even without violence, this marriage was systematically killing her, through indifference and profound loneliness. The absence of conflict was not peace, it was an emotional desert. The final stillness and the verdict. The divorce proceeded with alarming silence, a stark contrast to the tumultuous, highly publicized separation from Conrad Hilton Jr. There were no bitter accusations, no scandalous lawsuits that rocked public opinion. No reporters jammed the courthouse steps. No daily sensational headlines, no public recriminations. They simply parted ways like two passengers who had missed their train, neither truly at fault, simply no longer heading in the same direction, no longer sharing a common destination. It was an ending not of tragedy, but of utter, resonant emptiness. A quiet fading away rather than a dramatic rupture. The silence that had defined their marriage also defined its end. Taylor moved back to Hollywood, returning to the dazzling spotlights, to the glamorous films, and the glittering life she knew. she plunged back into her career with renewed vigor. Perhaps finding in the intensity of her roles a substitute for the emotional connection she craved. Wilding, like many English gentlemen after a broken relationship, retreated to his books. His loyal hunting dogs, and his quiet, reclusive life, a life perfectly suited to his reserved nature. Their parting was amicable in its lack of animosity, but profoundly sad in its utter lack of shared feeling. When the press, ever eager for a scandalous detail, once again questioned her about this inexplicable parting, she simply replied, her voice imbued with a thoughtful melancholy that spoke volumes about her nuanced understanding of the relationship. Michael was a good man. Very good, very polite. But I didn't need a good man. I needed a man who would live with me, not just sit beside me in silence. That answer, though concise, concealed a profound truth about the needs of a woman who yearned to feel, to be loved. To experience life fully, even with its inevitable storms. She realized that Wilding's goodness was merely a facade for his apathy, a cage constructed from indifference, however unintentional. His politeness was a barrier, not a bridge, to true intimacy. The silence he offered, initially a comfort, had become a prison. Years later, reflecting on this mysterious and quiet second marriage, Elizabeth Taylor once remarked, with a philosophical and poignant bitterness, a hard-won wisdom gained through experience. That was the time I fell in love with a lull. But I forgot that a lull can also drown you, slowly and painfully. And so it ended, a quiet chapter, like a strange, soundless interlude, devoid of crescendo or climax, yet leaving an invisible, deeply etched scar upon her soul. It was a case with no gunshots, no obvious casualties, but it was nonetheless a case of profound loneliness, of emotions starved to the point of exhaustion. And a permanent reminder of the bitter lesson of emptiness, and that a false peace can sometimes be far more terrifying than any storm. The illusion of peace can be a seductive but ultimately destructive force, particularly for a soul that yearns for true connection and the vibrant, sometimes messy, reality of lived emotion. This marriage, for Elizabeth Taylor, was a testament to the fact that the absence of pain does not equate to happiness, and that true love requires engagement, not just quiet coexistence. It was a lesson learned in the quiet, desolate landscape of an unfulfilled heart. Mike Todd, The Case of the Lover Lost to the Storm. Mike Todd didn't arrive like a gentle breeze, nor the faint mist of a dawn. He materialized like a furious tropical storm, unannounced, uninvited. And leaving Elizabeth Taylor no time to erect a single shelter or seek refuge. He possessed none of the handsome sophistication, the youthful charm, or the reserved demeanor of the men who had preceded him in her turbulent life. In fact, he was rough-hewn, boisterous, and utterly dismissive of convention. But he lived with an intense fervor. An unyielding, burning flame of a man who knew his time on earth was too precious to squander on trivialities. He didn't hesitate to cast aside rules, to shatter every boundary. And it was precisely that fiery intensity, that raw ferocity, that live as if tomorrow is the apocalypse philosophy, that caused Elizabeth Taylor, for the very first time in her tumultuous existence, to love with her entire being, to love with a desperate, all-consuming madness, holding nothing back. Reserving not an inch for reason, shedding every last defense from her previously shattered heart. This was no ordinary romance, it was a fateful collision. An irreversible event that irrevocably altered the emotional trajectory of her life. Mike Todd was no stranger to the inner circles of the entertainment industry. He was an executive producer of extraordinary caliber, a man of audacious vision, who had propelled the epic Around the World in 80 Days into a global phenomenon, sweeping prestigious awards and etching an indelible mark in cinematic history. Yet, before ascending to Hollywood legend, before becoming a mogul with a vast network of connections, he had been a hardened street hustler, a notorious gambler, an eccentric outlier who adhered to no established norms, a wanderer without papers. perpetually living outside the confines of law and societal rules. He was a volatile amalgam of primal instincts, scars earned from a life lived on the fringes, and a cunning, ingenious mind. When he encountered Taylor, she had already weathered 2 broken marriages, her heart tattered by repeated falls. And the name Elizabeth Taylor was more often whispered with scandal than spoken with genuine respect within high society circles. Public opinion often branded her a homewrecker, a troublemaker. But Mike Todd didn't see a flawless screen goddess draped in an immaculate facade. He saw a woman driven to maddening loneliness by being constantly viewed as a mere display object, a toy, an empty symbol, rather than a human being with genuine emotions and desires. He saw a battered soul yearning to be liberated, to live authentically, true to her core self. The theater of wild love. Their marriage was swift, executed in typical Todd fashion, rushed, loud, untamed, defying all conventions and the scorn of public opinion. Their wedding in February 1957 was no solemn ceremony. It was a grand theatrical production, an explosive spectacle, a veritable detonation of emotion and ostentation. Fireworks erupted, painting the night sky with brilliant colors, and it was even televised live to millions of captivated viewers. Flashbulbs popped incessantly, cheers roared through the air, and an infectious excitement permeated the entire space. But the fundamental difference this time was that Taylor's smile was genuine. Her smile was no longer an act, no longer a mere facade. It was the radiant smile of a woman finally living authentically, loved with a fierce, primal intensity. And when she uttered "I do" before the officiant, it wasn't a rehearsed line, but a solemn vow from the depths of her heart, the unwavering pledge of a soul that had found its destined counterpart. Mike Todd was unlike anyone she had ever known. He wasn't merely a lover. He was a conjurer of emotions, a man willing to move mountains to ensure his woman's happiness. He had a special room built in their mansion solely to house fresh flowers every morning. Bouquets of every hue and fragrance, like a secret garden dedicated exclusively to her. He purchased a lavish private jet, christened it the Liz, so they could circle the globe whenever she felt blue or lonely, or simply desired to witness a sunrise from a far-flung corner of the world. Such extravagance wasn't mere ostentation. It was a profound manifestation of unconditional love and absolute devotion. On one occasion, Taylor was filming in England, consumed by weariness and homesickness. Todd called her, his voice deep and resolute. "I missed you on the right side of my coffee cup this morning. I'll be there in 6 hours." And he was. He flew across an ocean for a minor sense of emptiness. A fleeting moment of longing, a connection that no words could adequately describe. Their love was not serene like a gentle stream or a tranquil lake, it was fire, a fierce, unyielding blaze, consuming everything mundane, every pretense. But Taylor adored it. She reveled in the feeling of being ignited, of living with such fervent passion, of feeling every sensation explode within her. Mike Todd didn't just love her, he taught her a priceless lesson about life and love. Not all love had to be accompanied by pain or imprisonment. Sometimes, it could burn fiercely, brilliantly, without consuming, leaving behind only the sweet ash of cherished memories. She had found a man willing to illuminate her life, rather than extinguish it. The unbidden storm. Fateful day. Then came the fateful day, a grim March morning forever etched into her mind, a day when the sky abruptly collapsed, and the brilliant flame of her love was cruelly extinguished by an unseen tempest. In March 1958, Mike Todd was preparing to fly to New York to accept the Showman of the Year award, a tremendous honor he richly deserved, a symbol of his boundless talent and relentless dedication. He pleaded with Taylor to accompany him, wanting her to be the first to witness that moment of triumph. But she was battling a severe flu, running a high fever, her body racked with fatigue. and her private doctor strictly forbade her from traveling. Mike laughed heartily, the last laugh she would ever see on his face, kissed her forehead lightly, full of love and reassurance. "It's okay, my darling. I'll be back before you even miss me." Those were the last words he spoke to her, and the last time she saw him alive, standing before her in flesh and blood. A promise never to be fulfilled, a tragic premonition that became a brutal reality. Mike Todd's private plane, the Liz, his pride and a symbol of his devotion to her, exploded in the stormy night sky, its wreckage scattered across a desolate, icy mountain in New Mexico. No one survived. Not a single body remained intact, no trace of life. All that was left were his charred wedding ring, a scorched symbol of a vow turned to ash, and a small silk swatch. Once his handkerchief he often used to clean her glasses, a fragile relic carrying the faint scent of the past, the only tangible evidence remaining of a love cruelly stolen by fate. This accident was not merely a personal tragedy, it was a baffling case, an inexplicable event that sent shockwaves through all of Hollywood. Taylor collapsed onto the cold bathroom floor upon hearing the thunderous news. She didn't weep, didn't scream in despair, didn't utter a single word. She simply crumpled, powerless. She had no strength left to react, as if her soul had detached from her body. She had to be rushed to the emergency room, suffering from severe dehydration and complete exhaustion. Newspapers blazed with searing headlines across every front page: Hollywood tragedy, producer Mike Todd killed in plane crash. They wove heart-wrenching tales, flowery eulogies. But no one knew the raw, agonizing truth that pierced her to her core: she no longer wished to live. Her life, once brilliantly illuminated, now plunged into a darkness deeper than ever before. In the weeks that followed, she refused to eat, refused to film, even refused to look in a mirror, unwilling to confront the image of a woman utterly lost, consumed by unbearable grief. Rumors circulated that she had repeatedly attempted to swallow sleeping pills, seeking death to end her torment. Perhaps true. Perhaps not. But one thing was clear beyond doubt. The light in her violet eyes had dimmed permanently, like a star that had faded from the night sky. Mike Todd's funeral was not a solemn ceremony, it was a lingering farewell. Like a mournful song without an ending, a drawn-out elegy that stretched on endlessly. Taylor dressed in black from head to toe, her face veiled to obscure her gaunt features, uttering not a single word throughout the service. She stood there, a statue of suffering, witnessing everything as if in a horrific dream. Later, her close friend revealed that she had whispered beside Mike Todd's closed coffin, a vow meant only for him, a fateful promise: "I don't need anyone else. Only you are enough. I will love you forever." Yet, life does not halt for the death of one man, even if his name was Mike Todd and he was the singular love of her life. Elizabeth Taylor was inexorably drawn back into Hollywood's brutal machinery, back to the blinding lights, back to the manufactured affections and tasteless kisses. She had to continue filming, to continue smiling for the public, to live a life without him. But from that moment on, within her heart, there would always be a void shaped like a storm, an invisible yet profound scar. A hollow that nothing could ever truly fill, where her love for Mike Todd continued to smolder, never to be extinguished. Years later, after enduring several more tumultuous marriages and divorces, after loving and being loved, Taylor would steadfastly state, her voice filled with profound contemplation and a lingering sorrow: "Mike was the only man I never stopped loving. He was the true love of my life." And people believed her. For only when she spoke of him did her voice tremble, only then did her eyes shimmer with a light of pain and memory. A genuine emotion that no one could ever feign. Mike Todd's death wasn't the end of a love story, it was the genesis of a tragic case, an unresolved mystery that would forever haunt Elizabeth Taylor, becoming a painful yet indelible chapter in the indictment of her life. A case where the victim had loved the perpetrator with all her heart, and death had claimed not just a man, but a vital part of the Hollywood queen's soul. Eddie Fisher, the case of the concrete husband and the ghost of betrayal. When Mike Todd plunged from the sky, shattering into frozen fragments on a New Mexico mountain, Elizabeth Taylor no longer walked, she slid, a catastrophic, uncontrolled descent into an abyss of desolate loneliness and despair. The gates of her heart, once flung wide open to embrace the tempest that was Mike Todd, now closed agonizingly, but not locked. And then, another figure entered her life, not with the gentle knock of a stranger, but with the subtle click of a lock disengaged from behind a furtive, clandestine entry, as with Eddie Fisher. He wasn't a sudden intruder, but rather a shadow that slipped through the fissure of her profound grief and vulnerability. This was no case of overt violence, but a chilling narrative of silent betrayal. A tragedy born from a misbegotten choice in the dim light of sorrow. Eddie Fisher was a crooning heartthrob, an idol of the 1950s youth, with a face as bright as any billboard poster. A charming smile, and a voice as smooth as silk, capable of melting the suburban hearts of millions across America. His fame was undisputed. But the most critical aspect for Taylor lay not in his public glamour, but in a cold, stark truth: Eddie was Mike Todd's closest friend. The only confidant Mike trusted implicitly. The man who stood shoulder to shoulder with him in audacious business ventures, the one to whom Todd confided his deepest secrets. It was Eddie who had held Todd's infant daughter for Taylor at the funeral, as she crumbled from exhaustion. It was he who had sung gentle ballads to lull her to sleep on nights when Mike Todd was tied up with meetings, unable to return to her side. He was a fragment of Mike, a haunting specter of the past. A constant, insidious reminder of the man who was gone. And it was he who was the first to knock on her bedroom door when Mike's body was still technically uncooled. When the last vestiges of her deceased husband's warmth still clung to the air. He came not as a grieving friend, but with a hidden agenda. She was utterly desolate, her pain tearing at her very flesh. He offered solace, with soft words and soothing gestures. She wept until her eyes were dry, having no desire left to live. He gently wiped away her hot tears, with what she later realized was a false concern. Once. Twice. Then one night, as the only light in the bedroom was the shifting, murky glow from a still smoldering cigarette, casting grotesque shadows on the walls, he kissed her. It wasn't the kiss of a sympathetic friend sharing sorrow. It was the kiss of a predator who had probed, who had discovered the weakest gate in the fortress of her heart, and slipped through, taking possession. It was a kiss of exploitation, an audacious gesture that ignited a global scandal. The public's verdict and the Queen's defiance. Eddie Fisher at that time was already married to Debbie Reynolds, America's sweetheart, the golden girl of the silver screen. A symbol of wholesome purity and idealized American family happiness. And ironically, Debbie was also Taylor's close friend. This public affair drove the global media into a frenzy. Tabloid newspapers screamed with lurid headlines, proclaiming it the betrayal of the century, an unprecedented event in Hollywood history. The public, who had once adored both Taylor and Debbie, now viewed Taylor as a shameless homewrecker, an immoral woman masquerading as a screen queen. Photographs of Taylor and Fisher, hand in hand, appeared openly on newspaper pages. Undeniable evidence of a moral transgression. But Taylor ignored every curse, every contemptuous gaze. She had lost one man to cruel fate, snatched away by destiny. And now, even if the entire world burned in righteous fury, even if her reputation crumbled to ash, she would not release her grip on the only person who made her feel less alone at night. The only one who seemed to fill the horrifying void in her heart after Mike's death. She would rather endure the judgment of the entire world than face the utter desolation again. To her, This wasn't an act of husband stealing, but an act of pure survival, a desperate clinging to a lifeline in the darkness. They married in May 1959, a ceremony conducted in a somber, almost clandestine silence, yet the public's bitterness reverberated everywhere. There were no dazzling fireworks, no pristine white gown. Only the relentless whispers of judgment and invisible knives repeatedly piercing Taylor's reputation, like bleeding gashes that festered daily. The immediate consequences were brutal and swift. Eddie Fisher lost a string of lucrative performing contracts, his singing career virtually ended. As for Taylor, she was subtly blacklisted by major studios. No one dared cast her in films, fearing public backlash and boycotts. Taylor's movie posters were ripped down in theaters, her images defaced. A conservative Texas minister even publicly declared on television, "If Hollywood continues to employ Liz Taylor, I will boycott the entire American film industry." Public opinion crowned her public enemy #1 of the American family. Yet, even in the eye of that storm, with the entire world turned against her, she still smiled. It wasn't a smile of happiness, but the grimace of a madwoman, a defiant rebel. One who believed she had found an ally in the chaos. For then, she believed she had found someone willing to shoulder the world's wrath with her. A man strong enough to stand against societal condemnation. She believed he was concrete, an unyielding fortress wall that would stand firm beside her. The concrete husband crumbles to dust. Alas! Eddie Fisher was not forged from tempered steel. He was no unyielding fortress wall as she had mistakenly believed. He was aptly dubbed the concrete husband, not for his solidity or resilience, but because he just stood there, useless, cracking, yet refusing to fully collapse, merely disintegrating slowly, piece by agonizing piece. When the media's fire consumed everything, when societal pressure bore down, Taylor, a warrior by nature, charged forward, directly confronting the public's wrath. She accepted smaller film roles, paid the price for her decisions, and fought back against an entire system that had abandoned her. She was strong to the point of isolation. Eddie, meanwhile, retreated, drowning in his own cowardice. He began writing memoirs, desperately attempting to paint himself as the victim. He sang mournful ballads in small, forgotten bars, a man without a narrative, without any meaning left to tell, a ghost of his former self. Taylor, though labeled a temptress, a destroyer, could never tolerate weakness, a pathetic lack of fortitude. She needed a strong, resilient man beside her, one who could brave the storm with her. But Eddie, instead of being someone she could lean on, became a heavy burden she had to drag through every press conference, every social gathering, every venomous interview. His weakness filled her with contempt. Tension between them exploded, not in loud arguments, but in the sharp thrusts of deep disappointment. Fisher grew pathologically jealous of Taylor's male co-stars, men he perceived as stronger and more masculine than himself. He feared losing her, yet possessed no understanding of how to keep her. Taylor, conversely, seethed with frustration over his passivity, his cowardice, his inability to protect either her or himself. On one occasion, at an elite party in Bel Air, amidst hundreds of Hollywood's most influential figures, she could endure no more. She spoke loudly, her words like daggers plunging straight into his fragile pride. "If you're going to be a man, then be one completely. Otherwise, go back to singing lullabies for lonely widows." No one at the party dared suppress their gasps or conceal their utter astonishment. The press, as always, either fabricated embellishments to heighten the drama or simply reported every word, every gesture, verbatim. Fisher could not endure this public humiliation. He walked out. Then, He wrote his memoirs, desperately attempting to recount his relationship with Taylor as if he were the hapless victim of a tornado that had ripped apart his peaceful family life. But no one believed him. Because Taylor, no matter how wicked she was perceived by the public, never pretended to love, and never pretended to be strong. She was the raw embodiment of truth. The final stillness, the verdict of passivity. She divorced Fisher not out of boredom with love, but out of weariness of living with a man utterly incapable of protecting himself. A man who had crumbled under pressure. It was a case of profound disillusionment, of a shattered belief. Later, when reporters questioned her about this marriage, Taylor stated bluntly, without a hint of hidden disappointment, "I needed a companion in this fight, not a karaoke partner who just knows how to croon sentimental ballads in a corner." That single statement encapsulated the entire essence of her third marriage. Taylor needed someone to fight the harsh world alongside her, not someone who would merely hide in the shadows. Decades later, public opinion still pointed to Taylor as the destroyer of the Reynolds family, an indelible stain on Hollywood's romantic history. But the truth was, Debbie Reynolds and Taylor eventually reconciled, becoming close friends, for both understood they were victims of a singular, weak man. As for Fisher, he was left behind in the shifting sands of time, silent, faded, his career in tatters, his name largely forgotten. He serves as a poignant reminder that sometimes weakness and passivity are far more terrifying than outright aggression. And so it ended, a somber chapter, a case of betrayal, not of lies but of sheer inadequacy. A case where the injured party desperately sought strength in a frail man, only to suffer the consequences of her own illusion. Eddie Fisher didn't destroy Taylor with violence or cold indifference, but with his utter helplessness, with a concrete nature that could not withstand the heat of life, leaving her to realize she remained alone in a marriage she had believed was her sanctuary. It was yet another scar in the indictment of the Scream Queen's life, a painful lesson in placing trust in the wrong hands. Richard Burton, The Case of the Lover Addicted to Love, to Liquor, to Taylor. If Elizabeth Taylor's previous husbands were mere accidents, temporary stops on the train of her life, or fleeting shadows drifting across the sky of her soul, then Richard Burton was an apocalyptic earthquake. He didn't just shake the foundations of her existence, he swept away everything, annihilating every remnant, both good and bad, only to be, in a cruel twist of fate, buried beneath that very rubble himself. This wasn't a mere chapter in a love story, it was a complex case file. An investigation into obsession, mutual destruction, and a love that possessed the very essence of a potent, destructive drug. She encountered him on the set of Cleopatra, a fateful film where the production budget exploded like a financial bomb. The cast and crew were pushed to the brink of exhaustion by a relentless schedule and endless scandals, nearly bankrupting the studios. Amidst the debris of a colossal cinematic project that threatened to bury everyone's careers, Taylor suddenly met a gaze that sent tremors through every vein in her body. A look like a lightning bolt piercing her very core. It was Richard Burton, the Welsh actor with a voice as deep and husky as a fiery sunset, a breath heavy with the haunting scent of whiskey, and eyes as fathomless as the deepest ocean, poised to swallow the entire soundstage, to devour any fragile soul caught in their depth. He was a predator of emotion, a man haunted by his own limits. He wasn't conventionally handsome, lacking the polished perfection of other film stars. His face was etched with the marks of a tumultuous life, yet he possessed a peculiar charisma, an irresistible allure of one who had lived many lives, an ancient soul concealed within the body of an addict. Taylor, proud, seasoned, having tasted enough of life's bitterness to believe nothing could surprise her, still felt her hand tremble as he took a glass, poured her a drink, and then whispered in that husky, mesmerizing voice, thick with raw magnetism, "We'll kill each other, Elizabeth, that's for sure. But before we die, I want to live inside you for at least one summer, to live with everything we have." and they plunged into each other like two colossal planets colliding, creating a cosmic explosion. Neither of them retained their own gravitational pull, their balance, or their reason. They were drawn together by a lethal force of attraction, an inescapable destiny. Hollywood's public crime. The problem? Both were already married, bound by sacred vows and intricate social ties. Taylor was still entangled in her scandalous marriage to Eddie Fisher, the man who had stolen her from her best friend. Burton, too, had a wife and children, a seemingly happy home. But within less than 3 months, their passionate delirium had obliterated their pasts. Both defied all conventions, trampled every boundary, shattering every moral and social rule to be together. Global media went insane, branding them Hollywood's public sin, an unprecedented blemish. Pope Paul VI vehemently denounced them from the Vatican, labeling their relationship licentious. Major directors turned their backs, abandoning projects. Sponsors rapidly withdrew funds, fearing association. Yet they, despite every curse, every judgment, every incurred loss, loved each other amidst the shattered remnants of a world stripped of its laws, devoid of any moral values capable of restraining them. Their love was a crime. A case that undermined public trust, and they were the culprits, ready to embrace every condemnation. Their first marriage, for yes, they married twice. As if to test the limits of faith and public patience, was an organized madness, a wild, unending theatrical performance. They lived in lavish villas overlooking the sea, hired an entire symphony orchestra to play exclusively for them each evening, enjoying classical music by candlelight. They smoked expensive Havana cigars before breakfast. A life of extravagance and recklessness. And they fought like two starved lions, their arguments erupting violently, incinerating everything around them. One day, in a fit of insane jealousy, Taylor smashed a large mirror in the bedroom simply because Burton glanced at a waitress for too long. A week later, Burton, in a drunken rage, threw her entire collection of precious diamonds into the swimming pool because he thought she had smiled too long at an Italian director at a party. Their quarrels were vivid evidence of the fervor and destruction they brought. But when they reconciled, the world seemed more beautiful, more vibrant than ever. Their post-storm tranquility was a stunning illusion. Burton spared no expense showering her with extravagant gifts, symbols of power and affection. He gifted her the famous 33-carat diamond, a gem so massive that Taylor's wrist ached from its weight. He wrote her letters whenever he was away, each line like a sharp blade carving into the reader's heart, full of haunting obsession and wild passion. "I can't love anyone else, Elizabeth. Even if you kill me with each of those cold glances, I will love you until my last breath." They starred in films together, over a dozen classic cinematic works, from iconic films like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf to The Taming of the Shrew. Audiences and critics alike couldn't distinguish whether they were acting or simply living. For the explosive rage in a scene, the tears streaming down the screen, the passionate kisses, all were real. No acting technique could replicate the raging madness simmering in the hearts of these addicts of love and liquor. They were living proof of the blurred lines between art and life, the double addiction and the horrific collapse. But the thing they were both addicted to, more brutally than even their fervent love, was alcohol. Burton drank as if it were a religion, a daily, indispensable ritual, a penance, or a means of escaping reality. And Taylor, so as not to be left behind, to be with him, to understand him, and to plunge with him into their private world, drank alone. They had nights where they emptied bottles of bourbon like water, then lay side by side on the cold floor, their mouths cut from broken glasses, yet still holding hands tightly like two souls refusing to surrender to the storm they themselves had created. They were accomplices in a prolonged act of self-destruction. Their first marriage ended in ashes in 1974. They divorced but could not break free from each other. Like two old addictions, despite attempts at sobriety, they always returned. Seeking another cigarette, another drink, another kiss. The separation was merely a pause, a brief investigation before returning to the main case. A year after their divorce, in 1975, they remarried. This time, there were no dazzling fireworks, no friends, no press. Just two souls so addicted to each other they feared breathing if not in sync, feared existing without the other. It was a desperate reunion of two addicts. But this second marriage was even shorter-lived. Their lives now consisted of a dense darkness. A desolate wasteland where pain was no longer a mere seasoning, it was the main course, the only sustenance for their diseased relationship. They had exhausted every other emotional nuance, leaving only pain and destruction. In 1976, they divorced again. This time, it was permanent. Though they still secretly sent letters, still called each other on drunken nights, still saved each other's numbers under old nicknames. Burton married someone else. Taylor also embarked on new relationships. But none of these new partners could ever replace the other's place in their hearts. No one could fill the void only they truly understood. In 1984, Richard Burton died of a cerebral hemorrhage, a quiet, sudden death, utterly undramatic for a man who had lived such a tumultuous life. A cruel end to a stormy existence. When Taylor heard the news, she didn't weep, not a single tear rolled down her cheeks. Only silence. A terrifying silence, as if the world had stopped spinning. Then, after a moment, she spoke. Her voice husky with profound sorrow, a confession and a final verdict. That's it. The only man who dared to love me enough to destroy himself is gone. And so it concluded a painful chapter. A case file closed, yet the questions surrounding this toxic relationship lingered unanswered. A case of addicts, self-destructive souls, fragments of love and madness. Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, the two protagonists in this tragedy, together wrote an unforgettable indictment of love's power and destruction, of obsession, and of incurable addictions. This was more than just a story of two Hollywood stars, it was a warning, a study of the fragile boundaries between affection and annihilation. John Warner, the case of the husband lost in the political cage. After the devastating whirlwind named Richard Burton, twice loved, twice married, twice mutually destroyed with brutal intensity, Elizabeth Taylor stood at the crossroads of her life, her heart a mosaic of irreparable scars, haunted by a singular illusion, stability. She was utterly weary of the blinding glare of the spotlights, the cold weight of surreal diamonds, the ceaseless flow of liquor from silver goblets. She yearned for tranquility, a safe harbor. She wanted to sample what the tabloids sensationally dubbed a normal life, a luxury she had never truly tasted. This was not a criminal case in the traditional sense, but a psychological one. A silent, imperceptible disintegration. And then, John Warner entered her life, as if dispatched from an entirely different world, a foreign planet where different rules and values held absolute sway. He was a handsome, educated, composed politician, a man of decorum, who had served as the Secretary of the Navy of the United States, a public servant, a paragon of convention, of closed-door meetings and carefully crafted statements. He didn't drink himself into oblivion, didn't bellow in fury, didn't smash mirrors or throw objects. Nor did he write passionate love letters in the dead of night. John Warner walked the straight and narrow, wore impeccably tailored suits, spoke in measured, correct phrases, adhering to every unwritten rule of the elite. And Taylor, in her most vulnerable moment, desperate for peace, mistakenly believed that this very correctness was precisely what she needed. The key to liberating her from the chaotic vortex she had known. They met in 1976. 2 years later, in 1978, they married. This union came with no triumphant fanfare, no global scandal. There was no angry pope denouncing them from the Vatican. No reporters scaling fences for exclusive scoops. There was only a proud, yet quietly subdued Elizabeth Taylor stepping into a world of buttoned-up collars, serious meetings, and hushed dinners by candlelight, where every word was meticulously weighed. She departed the dramatic stage of Hollywood to step onto the political stage, a stage where she was given no true role. The trap of conformity and the Queen's ghost. But the core issue was this: Taylor was not born to live quietly. She was fire, the eye of a storm, the epicenter of all attention, of all drama. She needed to burn, to exist within her own chaos. And John Warner, though he loved her in the manner of a refined gentleman, simply didn't know how to live alongside such an immense icon, a soul so explosive. He failed to comprehend her intrinsic nature. Unable to decipher the code of a screen queen. When Warner campaigned for the Senate, Taylor did everything in her power to aid her husband's political ambitions. She stood backstage, silently offering support. She waved to admiring crowds. She offered composed shrugs to the pointed, malicious questions from reporters about her scandalous past. She strove to become the perfect senator's wife, a model political spouse. But behind the dazzling political spotlight, she gradually began to feel like a beautiful souvenir that had passed its expiration date, an outdated decorative item, no longer holding true value, no longer seen for who she truly was. She was a queen imprisoned in a political glass cage, where her husband's aura eclipsed her own being. On one occasion, at an important campaign party in Virginia, a conservative socialite, with a contemptuously whispered voice, leaned in and murmured to her husband, "I don't think Mrs. Taylor fits in with these traditional Southern weddings. She's just too flamboyant, too different." Taylor heard it, every single word, crystal clear. She showed no outward reaction. She merely poured more liquor into her glass, and remained silent. But that very night, she vomited violently in the bathroom, not from drink, but from the crushing feeling of being misplaced on a stage where there was no role for her, no space to shine. She was no longer the fierce Cleopatra or the ferocious Martha, she was a faded shadow. This was a case of spiritual deterioration, where the victim felt herself slowly dying. Warner became so consumed by his political life that he had no time left for her. His schedule was packed with confidential meetings. Campaign efforts were relentless. Press conferences were tense. Crucial votes loomed. And Taylor, the queen whom all of Hollywood had once bowed to, whom millions of fans had adored, now became an invisible shadow trailing a man who no longer saw who she was, who no longer recognized the fire within her. She wasn't a case for him to solve, but a burden for him to carry. The quiet death of a legend. She quietly and stealthily returned to alcohol, then to sleeping pills, seeking a dreamless sleep, an escape from reality. And then, something more terrifying than all else, emptiness. For nothing killed Taylor faster than the sensation of having no one left to fight for, nothing left to win, no spotlight left to stand beneath and glow. She was a warrior without a battle, a queen without a throne. They lived together in a prolonged silence, a life sentence without appeal. Warner remained a good husband in the polite, civil, meticulously proper way of an East Coast gentleman. But that very goodness, that chilling stability, slowly killed her a little more each day, a gradual death of the soul. No one scolded her. But no one needed her to shine anymore, no one needed her to explode. She was no longer the object of jealousy or passionate arguments, but a ghost within her own home. One bleak autumn morning, as she looked at herself in the mirror, her hair neatly styled, wearing a serious blazer, her face devoid of the glittering makeup of the film set, showing only a weary and lifeless countenance, Taylor spoke to herself, her voice tinged with bitter irony and cold realization. "I've lived like a lady. and died like an outdated legend. It was a self-pronounced verdict, a cruel truth discovered within her own life. In 1982, they divorced. There was no uproar, no bloodshed, no shocking scandal. Just two people sitting down, looking at each other, their eyes filled with cold understanding, and together realizing they couldn't try anymore. This marriage was a silent failure, a case without a perpetrator, only lost souls. Taylor returned to California, where she belonged, where the stage lights still called her name, albeit faintly. Warner remained in Washington, continuing his political life. In a world of frameworks and rules, two worlds, once reluctantly attempting to intersect, now turned their backs on each other like two cold rivers flowing in opposite directions, never to meet again. Later, when asked about this seemingly peaceful yet deeply tragic marriage, Taylor replied, her voice filled with acceptance and a touch of self-pity. "I don't blame John. I only blame myself for trying to be someone I never was, and could never be. That was my fault, not his." And so it ended, another sad chapter closed in Elizabeth Taylor's life's indictment. A case with no murder, no bloodshed, yet one that detailed the slow, silent death of a soul, a destruction without a sound. John Warner was not the culprit. He was simply an ordinary man lost in the extraordinary world of a queen, and that very normalcy became an invisible blade, slowly extinguishing the fire within her. It was a costly lesson in forcing oneself into an ill-fitting mold, a tragedy of eternal displacement. Larry Fortensky, the case of the last outsider in an unending symphony. By the 1990s, Hollywood had changed its colors. It was no longer the exclusive stage for luminous icons like Elizabeth Taylor. The spotlight now shone on different names, younger, leaner, and, crucially, with fewer scandals. This was a decade of transition, where new stars emerged with delicate beauty, a cool image, and, most importantly, a more sanitized public record, suiting the shifting public taste. The dazzling lights now illuminated other faces, carefully packaged and meticulously curated. Elizabeth Taylor. With her magnificent beauty, legendary violet eyes, and tumultuous life, no longer stood at the center of prestigious award ceremonies or the front row of glamorous red carpets. She was now an old monument, lavishly opulent, full of majesty, but forgotten in a luxurious museum no one visited anymore, no one cared to admire. The media, once worshipping and scrutinizing every detail of her private life, now turned its attention to fresher narratives. A case of oblivion was slowly enveloping her, not through noisy attacks, but through a cold, unsettling indifference, more terrifying than any criticism. Approaching 60, after 7 broken marriages and countless personal tragedies, Taylor wasn't just physically weary. She was emotionally exhausted. Her body, once the epitome of Hollywood beauty, now bore the burden of chronic pain from dozens of surgeries, from the tormenting back pain and the lingering effects of painkiller and alcohol abuse. Her soul, once ablaze with fierce passions, was now a tapestry of scars, voids of loss, and profound loneliness. Fame had brought her everything, except the one thing she craved most, a simple, genuine love, unadulterated by glamour or calculation. She had navigated the most ardent affairs with Richard Burton, relationships brimming with power with John Warner, and even the suffocating peace with Michael Wilding. Now, she wasn't seeking a prince, a star, or a man deemed perfect by society's definition. She merely wanted a safe haven, an authenticity untouched by the superficiality of the world she had inhabited her entire life. She no longer wished to perform, no longer wanted to don the facade of Hollywood royalty when her heart was bleeding. And it was then, just as all the lights seemed to dim, when she was at the lowest point of her life, that Larry Fortensky appeared. He wasn't a talented actor, nor a powerful politician. He certainly wasn't a wealthy magnate. He belonged to none of the elite circles Taylor was accustomed to, those refined, powerful, intelligent, and ambitious men. Fortensky was just a blonde, sturdy construction worker with the rough hands of a laborer. His past was far from glorious, a history of assault charges, addiction, and having dropped out of school at 16. He was an outcast, a lost fragment adrift in the currents of life, seemingly unable to touch the glittering world of Taylor's fame, diamonds, and silk. This contrast wasn't merely about social status or wealth. It was about the very essence of their beings, their worldviews, every facet of their lives. They met at the Betty Ford Center, an unexpected location, a refuge for wounded souls seeking redemption. A level playing field where all pretense of fame was stripped away. Taylor entered to reclaim herself, to battle her inner demons, the addictions to painkillers, alcohol, and the deep depression that had plagued her after decades in the spotlight. She sought peace, a genuine release from the storms that had submerged her life. Fortensky wasn't there for a spiritual quest or enlightenment, he was there to avoid jail time, a desperate choice, a last chance to escape the mire of self-destruction. Two individuals, seemingly unrelated, belonging to two completely opposite worlds, happened to converse during a group therapy session. In this space, everyone dropped their masks, sharing hidden wounds and pains without judgment. In that vulnerable yet honest atmosphere, Fortensky, the clumsy construction worker, with his rough exterior but inherent sincerity, shyly grinned as he called Taylor the pretty lady from the black and white movies. It was a naive remark, lacking cinematic knowledge, yet it was utterly genuine and disarmingly simple. And Taylor, for the first time in years of straining under the persona of a queen, an untouchable icon, laughed. It was a clear, innocent laugh, like a 16-year-old girl. A laugh that had never appeared on magazine covers or the silver screen, a laugh devoid of artifice, calculation, or concern for image. That laugh was proof that deep down, she was still a woman longing for simple, genuine love. She later recounted, with a distant, pensive gaze, as if analyzing crucial evidence in a complex case where she was both witness and victim. Perhaps I chose him precisely because he didn't know who I was, or at least didn't care about the title of queen. There was nothing to act out, no one had to bow down to anyone. That statement encapsulated Elizabeth Taylor's ultimate desire, to be herself, to be loved without wearing a crown. Fortensky had no glamour, no power, no wealth for Taylor to exploit or polish her image. He only had authenticity, and that became an invaluable treasure for a woman utterly weary of false praise and calculating relationships. They fell in love in the twilight glow of California desert sunsets, where the stillness was strangely profound, where the old demons of addiction were replaced by honest handholding and sincere conversations about life, about scars, about simple dreams. Fortensky, the clumsy construction worker, a man of manual labor, accustomed to dirt and sweat, moved into Taylor's opulent mansion like a lost wanderer in a royal palace, a surreal image. But he brought a fresh breeze, a simplicity she desperately craved. His unpretentiousness was the antidote to the complexity and artificiality she had lived with her entire life. And Taylor, the proud queen, accustomed to lavish parties and refined menus of the elite, personally poured him beer, learned to eat hamburgers instead of caviar, discovering a rustic, common life she had never known. These seemingly small, ordinary moments became precious gems in her otherwise extravagant life. She found joy in the simplest things, like a young girl exploring the world. In 1991, they married. It was one of the most peculiar weddings in Hollywood history, held at Michael Jackson's Neverland, attended by over 100 famous stars, from Liza Minnelli to Nancy Reagan. The event was an odd confluence of two worlds, an improbable blend of Taylor's endless luxury and Fortensky's simplicity. The press dubbed it Cinderella in reverse, when the dazzling princess married a construction worker. The public was simultaneously curious, skeptical, and admired Taylor's courage in defying all conventions. But Taylor didn't care for the gossip. For her, Fortensky represented the last remaining time. The final glimmer of light before all the stage lights went out, before the curtain of her life fell permanently. This was the case of a fragile hope, a final attempt to find genuine happiness. She wanted to believe that this time would be different, that simplicity and sincerity would be the key to lasting love. The undeniable truth and the death of illusion. But cruel reality could not be masked by romantic fairy tales. Like a case without a happy ending. Human nature and profound differences ultimately revealed themselves, inevitably. Married life was no simple fairy tale, especially when two people came from vastly different worlds. Fortensky, a man accustomed to the freedom and ruggedness of a laborer's life, could not endure the constant media scrutiny. Paparazzi hounded him everywhere, documenting every gesture, every word. He often struck paparazzi, smashing their cameras, reacting violently to the invasion of privacy he had never known. The pressure was too immense for a simple man, used to living freely. And then, he started drinking again, turning to alcohol as an escape from unbearable pressure, from loneliness and the feeling of being out of place in a world too glamorous. The old addiction, seemingly under control, resurfaced like a ghost, haunting his life. Taylor, too, was fading. Old age crept in, illnesses tormented her, and layers of memories, like a white storm, weighed heavily on her mind, ceaselessly haunting her. Her challenging life made her more vulnerable, and her reliance on medication deepened. They argued over the smallest things. Everyday trivialities becoming the fuse for major quarrels: dinner too cold, the dog barking too loud, her going to bed too early, him staying up too late. These daily frictions weren't just ordinary arguments, they were growing cracks in the emotional wall of their relationship, revealing a deep incompatibility in their lifestyles and habits. Once love had passed the romantic threshold, all that remained were two individuals who didn't know how to coexist in each other's worlds. Unable to reconcile their profound differences in personality and outlook. John Warner and Taylor were two separate worlds, but with Fortensky and Taylor, they were two mismatched pieces. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't fit together. One craved tranquility and simplicity, the other needed freedom and roughness. Differences in age, educational background, life experience, and coping mechanisms for pressure created an unbridgeable chasm. What initially attracted them, their differences, ultimately became their greatest obstacle. In 1996, they divorced. The separation was quiet, not dramatic like Taylor's previous ones. There were no bitter disputes over assets, as Fortensky demanded nothing. No one cried to the press. No harsh accusations were hurled. Everything transpired in a chilling silence, like a final verdict pronounced without a court. An acceptance of fate by two people who had tried but could not find harmony. Taylor uttered only one sentence, a cold conclusion to another chapter of her life, a heartbreaking truth. "I don't need a prince. I just need someone who doesn't scare me." This statement, though concise, encapsulated all the pain and lessons she had endured. She wasn't afraid of violence or betrayal like in previous relationships, but she was afraid of disappointment, the loss of her last hope, and the shattering of the illusion of simple love. And Fortensky, who had been the last embrace, the final peaceful anchor in her tumultuous life, left the mansion in silence. He took nothing from this marriage, demanded nothing. As if he were merely a transient guest in her life, a man who had fulfilled his mission quietly and without a trace. He returned to his own world, a world where he felt he belonged. After that, Taylor never loved again. She firmly closed the door to her heart, no longer opening herself to any romantic relationships. She dedicated the rest of her life to charity. especially advocating for HIV/AIDS victims, a disease that claimed her close friend Rock Hudson. She found meaning in helping others, transforming personal pain into beneficial action. She spent her time discussing her past, her famous roles, her unforgettable loves, but never revisited the present with a new relationship. The glamour of love faded, giving way to the light of compassion. Fortensky, in turn, retreated into a secluded life, completely vanishing from the spotlight. He never gave interviews, never wrote memoirs, never recounted their love story, as if the only person who had ever touched Elizabeth Taylor's final heart had vowed to remain silent until the very end, keeping the secret of this last love affair. His silence was a final gesture of respect for the woman who had briefly entered his life. When she passed away in 2011, Larry Fortensky, though they hadn't been in contact for years, still sent a wreath of pure white flowers. There was no sender's name on the wreath, a discreet yet profoundly meaningful gesture. Only a small, handwritten card, bearing just 2 lines. "I remember the desert light. And your laughter." And so it ended, a final chapter. A final case closed in the indictment of Elizabeth Taylor's romantic life. It wasn't an explosive case, filled with dramatic revelations or bitter goodbyes, but a case of quietness. Of last hopes extinguished, of an icon gradually fading into oblivion. Larry Fortensky wasn't a villain who caused tragedy, he was merely a final witness. A simple piece that couldn't fit into her grand and complex picture. This marriage is a reminder that sometimes, what we crave most, normalcy and stability, is precisely what quietly destroys us. If it doesn't align with our true nature. It was the unending symphony of a life riddled with tragedies, a symphony Elizabeth Taylor played with all her passion and vulnerability. And Larry Fortensky was the final note, resonating silently, closing the case of a legend. This marriage, though brief and ending in silence, stands as one of the most honest accounts of Elizabeth Taylor's yearning for an ordinary life, something even a queen couldn't truly possess. The verdict on the accomplices and the warning from the eternal flame. Elizabeth Taylor once uttered a phrase that, at first glance, sounded like a confession, but was in fact the final, proud declaration of a woman who lived as if every day were an eternal scene and every romance a recurring earthquake, a case perpetually reopened. "I've been married to a lot of men, but I've only loved a few." That statement wasn't a sign of weakness, nor an admission of regret for past mistakes. It was a proud, razor-sharp declaration from a queen who never bowed to anyone. Not even fate itself. It stood as the final piece of evidence in the case file of her life. 7 husbands. 8 marriages. A relentless, unending chain of relationships spanning decades. Not a single romance was gentle, and no one was suitable by conventional societal standards. And precisely because of this, she became an icon, an eternal symbol of passion, defiance, and unconquerable beauty. It wasn't because she loved too much, or too fiercely, but because she never apologized for it. She never considered her marriages to be flaws to be hidden, but rather indispensable chapters in her life's chronicle. She was an open case, one that no one could fully decipher. Taylor never attempted to normalize herself to fit any man or any societal mold. On the contrary, she loved like a raging inferno, an uncontrollable wildfire, either consuming everything, turning it to ash, or dazzling so blindingly that those who dared to look were seared. Her romances weren't meant to be lessons from mistakes, but warnings, chilling admonitions about a truth that everyone seemingly knew, yet no one would accept, no one would believe. No man was strong enough to contain a woman like Elizabeth Taylor. And she didn't need them to be. From her first husband, Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr., a young socialite who had never truly seen the glare of cameras, never experienced the pressure of fame, to her last, Larry Fortensky, a construction worker lost in a world of red carpets and utterly foreign rules, all melted in her presence. They melted not from weakness, but because they believed they were loving a woman, an individual they could hold and control, but in reality, they were trying to live with an icon. An eternal flame that could not be extinguished. They were moths drawn to the fire, and this case is the forensic report of those haunting demises. In her wild midnight binges at her Bel Air mansion, amidst the smoke-filled, tense filming sessions in Rome. Or on those occasions when she buried her exhausted face behind oversized Chanel sunglasses in hospitals, Taylor always maintained one thing for herself: control. Even when everything seemed to crumble, marriages dissolved, beauty faded, health plummeted, she always knew how to transform the fragments, the wreckage, into myth. Turning tragedy into an unending narrative. She was the architect of her own destiny, the one who crafted new chapters in the case of her life. And now, as young women sit in cafes adorned with fake flowers, scrolling through TikTok, watching videos of couples arguing over trivialities like not getting video calls every night, perhaps they should pause, reflect on Elizabeth Taylor's story, and ask themselves, do I want Elizabeth Taylor's kind of love, a love so intense it consumes both self and other? An endless indictment of extreme emotions, or do I just want a 90-minute Netflix movie with a predictable happy ending? Because Elizabeth Taylor was not the ideal model for love. She was a curse for those who believed that loving intensely would save them from emptiness, that it would bring eternal meaning to life. She was a living, breathing warning. She sampled every type of man the world could offer, from obscenely wealthy to utterly impoverished, from brilliantly intelligent to wildly insane, from cinematic giants to clumsy laborers. From poetic souls to political powers, from functional alcoholics to hopeless drunks. And the soul, chilling conclusion drawn from decades of painful experimentation was this: no one lasted long enough not to disappoint her. No one was strong enough to withstand the fire of Elizabeth Taylor. So, what is the lesson here? What is the final verdict on Taylor's life? If you choose to love like Elizabeth Taylor, with all that intensity, passion, and defiance of limits, be prepared to live a life where no one dares to accompany you through the entire night. A life where you will face ultimate solitude even in your most fervent moments. You will, inevitably, burn the bridge to your own peace. Or, more concisely, for the young women of the digital age, those who idealize love as cinema, as endless romantic scenes, as drama that adds spice to life. Drama is not seasoning. It is acid. And even if you are as beautiful as Elizabeth Taylor, even if you are an eternal icon, acid will still corrode your heart, piece by piece, until only ashes remain. That is the final judgment on a legend.